Well, thank you very much for coming along to this morning's webinar, this afternoon's webinar for those of you in other parts of the world, to launch the Smart Centres Index 1, the first edition of the Smart Centres Index, building on some research which CN carried out a couple of years ago, the Smart Jurisdictions Index, which was our beginning of investigating this topic. I'm Mike Wardle, I'm Head of Indices for the ZN Group, responsible for our longitudinal research into financial and commercial centres across the world. With me today is Professor Michael Manelli, our Executive Chairman, who will be adding some thoughts later on in the presentation. And we'll both be here to answer any questions or comments that you have towards the end of this session. So the Smart Centres Index is part of the Long Finance Initiative, set up by ZN to look at the question of when we'd know that our financial system was working. We believe that trade and commerce are part of that question, and the SCI looks at the technology side of finance, trade, and commerce. As I mentioned, we do conduct research into financial and commercial centres across the world. We focus on place because it's in the cities and the economic clusters of the world that we believe a real difference is made. Our research include the Global Financial Centres Index, the Global Green Finance Index, and other research into technology and finance. And if you're at all interested in the topics of our research, please do get in touch. We're always very happy to talk to people who show an interest. So the Smart Centres Index is a factor assessment index. These indices take account of two different types of data. First of all, perception data drawn from surveys of professionals across the world, and particularly people who are working in the field in which we are interested. The second type of data which we take into account are quantitative data measures drawn from a wide range of external sources. There's over 120 different data models that we build into the Smart Centres Index. And these two sets of data, the assessments given by professionals and the quantitative factors, are combined using a machine learning algorithm which looks at the relationships between the two data sets and combines them into a single model. This process, in effect, does the weighting of quantitative data measures and also allows us to understand which factors are affecting the development of individual places. And the Smart Centres Index is designed to look at technology and innovation. It's looking at the readiness of places to exploit new technology applications, how good they are at supporting an ecosystem which encourages such development. We're interested in science, technology, energy systems, machine learning, all those things which are the exciting bits of the development of new technology in our commercial centres. And we are particularly interested in how attuned places are in terms of supporting the growth of new technology in their own area. In particular, we drill down into three individual dimensions which we think are important. First of all, innovation support, the approach taken in that area to regulation and support for the innovation and technology industry. So how is the commercial ecosystem of regulation and support driving change? Secondly, creative intensity, the extent to which technology and innovative industries are embedded in the economy of the centre. Are starting to see an impact across all aspects of economic activity and development. And third, delivery capability, effectively the quality of the work being undertaken in that centre. Turning on to the results, first some headlines. London leads the rankings in this first edition of the index, with New York second, Singapore in third place. The US take 5 of the top 10 places in the index, with a very strong performance from the US. Hong Kong, Tokyo, and Zurich also score in the top 10. Chinese centres don't feature as strongly as we might have expected, given our knowledge of what's going on in China at the moment. And on average, Chinese centres score lower for innovation support as one of the dimensions of the SCI than their overall rating. I'll come to this a number of times, but this is the first edition of the index, and we may well see some movement in these placings over time. And the great majority of the centres featured in the first edition of the Smart Centres Index are located in North America, Asia Pacific, and Western Europe. So looking at a world map, the clusters are shown there in terms of the centres that are shown in the first edition of the index. There are 5 centres outside of North America, Asia Pacific, and Western Europe. The leading one of those is Dubai. It rates 34th in the index. Taking a look at who responds to our survey. First of all, by sector, just over a quarter of the respondents to the survey are working directly in technology. Another quarter are working in professional services, with another number of others working in finance and the knowledge sector, that's universities and academia, and in policy and public finance. So a preponderance of people working in professional services and technology. And in this first edition by region, the bulk of the responses are from Western Europe, with those in Asia Pacific the next largest group. Looking at the centres that feature at the top of the SCI rankings, 2 things to say. First of all, there are a number of centres in this top 20 who are well-established, large city commercial centres, the London, Singapore, New York, Hong Kong, the big centres which we expect perhaps to do well. There are, however, a number of smaller clusters and centres who make it into the top 20, thinking about Oxford, Cambridge, Glasgow in the UK, Dallas, Fort Worth in the US. And it's showing that I think particularly in technology, there are some smaller centres who are making big strides in terms of the development of their innovation and technology offering. This chart just shows the relative scores on the individual dimensions of innovation, support, creative intensity, and delivery capability for that top 20. What this really shows when you get into the detailed figures is that the leading centres are generally strong across all 3 of these areas. But some centres are relatively weaker or stronger in some areas. But generally, there's for the leading centres, they're strong across each of the dimensions. Just looking at the regional results, looking at the top 10, first of all, in Western Europe, London tops the first edition of this index and also ranks first in each of the sub-dimensions of the SCI. Just a reminder again that longitudinal research in this kind of research trend is important. So we'll be looking very carefully at the next and next editions of the index to see whether the pattern that's established in the first edition of the SCI continues over time. Western Europe broadly scores higher for the innovation support dimension, regulation and other support systems, than for the others. Oxford and Cambridge in the UK, who I mentioned earlier, score very highly for delivery capability, where they're ranked 17th globally for delivery capability. That's the quality of the people and the quality of work going on. They're ranked 7th and 6th, so they do very well in that aspect. Stockholm does very well for creative intensity, and so here we start to see the individual differences between centres and how we can use those how centres can use those to understand better their position in relation to competitors and collaborators across the world. Turning to Asia Pacific, there are several centres in the top rankings, but overall Asia Pacific centres score less highly for innovation support, the dimension about regulation and support. And as I mentioned before, Chinese centres in particular seem to rank surprisingly low in the first edition of the index, given the work we know is taking place on innovation and high-tech solutions. Again, we'll be watching that space in terms of future editions of the index. North America, as I've already mentioned, they perform very well. New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles appear in the top 5 centers in the world. Vancouver is an interesting place to watch. Again, in creative intensity, it scores very much higher than its overall ranking in the index, and suggests there's a cluster of activity in Vancouver which may bear fruit, and we'll be keeping an eye on what's happening there. Looking at other regions in the world, there's only 5 centers, as I mentioned, from other parts of the world that feature in the first edition of this index, with Dubai taking the leading place amongst those centers. I'm going to turn to the kind of data that underlies the SCI. First of all, we can look at the index results through the lens of areas of competitiveness. These are the groupings which we make of the instrumental factors, the hard data measures that are incorporated in the index. And the range of factors that we use is designed to reflect what it means to be a strong smart center. So both technology development, of course, but also business environment, human capital, infrastructure, the things that make a place a good place to be and to work. And we run the index analysis for each of these areas of competitiveness separately. You'll see on this chart the rankings shown for each of those areas: technology, financial services, reputation, etc. You'll see that most of the leading centers lead across a range of these areas, New York and London taking first and second place in both of these areas, but New York taking the lead on some, London on the others. Other centers, though, have strengths in particular areas. For example, Chicago, Oxford, Cambridge have rank higher in human capital than they do in the overall index. Toronto and Vancouver are strong in the business environment factors. So this again gives information to financial centers and commercial centers and to people who are thinking of expanding their business about where they might go. If human capital is very important to you, you need to go somewhere where you know there's a depth of skills in the workforce and the ability to train and continue training your staff. We also produce analyses relating to reputational advantage. This compares the overall rating we come to in the Smart Centers Index with the average of the assessments given to centers in the surveys we conduct. This enables us to show, in effect, where places are being given higher scores in the survey than they would have been if we did an assessment just on the quantitative data. It shows again that most of the leading centers in the SCI do have a reputational advantage. It shows, I think, the effect of being a well-known center and suggesting that there is a premium to being well-known as a place in terms of people's view of how you do in terms of your technology development. Again, we'll want to look at the trend over 2 or 3 editions of the index to see whether leading centers' reputational advantage continues, or whether there's a closer match between people's reputation and the assessments they receive and the quantitative results that underlie the index. And similarly, we can look at the other end of the table at reputational disadvantage. These are centers where the quantitative data would suggest that the center is doing better than people have rated that center when they come to assess it in the survey. So these are places that are likely to be doing more in terms of technology and innovation than people know about, and may need to do more work to market themselves and take forward improvement in their reputation. There is, of course, more detail in the full report, which you can find on the ZN website. We'll send a link to the report along with the presentation slides after this event. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions and comments after some observations from our chairman, Professor Michael Manelli.
Mike, thank you very much. And it really is it's a very sensitive time when you have the birth of a new index. So if you wouldn't mind just moving to the next slide. I've really got 4 slides here, and I'd just like to comment on a few items. Firstly, the reason that we were quite interested in developing this index was because technology affects all of us in all sorts of ways. This particular slide is looking at blockchain, and whilst a number of people have put blockchain almost firmly within the fintech arena, actually this diagram shows you here, this is from Cambridge, shows you that perhaps a third of the potential applications are in the banking and finance sector, with another 12% in insurance, but the remaining 58% are spread all across the place. And this would apply to just about any technology. If we were talking about remote sensing and satellites, new transportation technology, renewables energy, recycling, what you will find is that these technologies spread around and affect all sectors, and therefore they affect all industries. Sorry, by the way around, all industries, therefore all sectors. So I think that's an important thing. The second thing that I'd like to emphasize in all of this is that at the moment, this is a new index, and it's an extremely tight index. We don't see the spreads that we see in our other indices, those being the Global Financial Centers Index or the Global Green Finance Index, or even some work we have done on the Global Intellectual Property Index. For an opening index, it's pretty darn tight. And when Mike was showing us the reputation slides, what you can do is take the positive reputation, subtract it, the negative reputation, and add it. So, for example, Guangzhou, which had a negative reputation of minus 48, implied that if people rated it fairly, it would be 48 points higher. And that would actually halve the distance between Guangzhou and London. So it's an extremely tight index. And that probably reflects a number of things. Early days in the index mean we are pruning out into centers with fewer evaluations. But secondly, that technology is extremely fluid. It is really global technology. I remember when I moved into science and technology in the 70s, people would frequently assert, oh, this is the best technology in our country, or when I was working in the Ministry of Defense, this is the best British technology. These days, people are not fussed about the source of the technology. That may be somewhat ironic given Huawei discussions, but nevertheless, they're less concerned about it. They want the best technology that they can possibly get. Next slide, Michael. Now, this slide is really just to point out a few obvious things, but we have focused on cities, and this unit of analysis has traditionally been a better unit of analysis for economic activity than pushing things across an entire nation. This dates back to some of Jane Jacobs' observations in the 70s. However, while it is a good unit of analysis for many actions, technology again falls into that fluid area. Where it might be in future editions of this index, we're going to be having a little bit of a discussion about what is a center. When it comes to some of our other indices, for example, London is seen as a unit, whereas you'll have noticed here, it has been divided between London, Oxford, and Cambridge. So is it a London cluster? Is it 3 separate city clusters? Or is it, in fact, a national cluster? We'll be exploring that quite a bit. We'll be exploring that not least because technology in the IT sense has been a major driver towards dispersal of economic activity. Note that things like Slack came out of the technology sector, remote working, early days of outsourcing, even as early as the late 70s and 80s. Moving operations, say, for example, to India, showed that ICT, information communications technology, was highly mobile and fluid. So it'll be interesting to see where that heads. Now, when we look at this area, one of the problems we try to face is this last point here, how to promote and regulate growth. Well, one of the things about most financial centers is that they're very susceptible to policy changes. So if we just have a quick look here at the next slide, there are a number of regulatory approaches that one can take. And Mike and I have picked out just a few. So you can see various categories of regulation: economic regulation, social regulation, and institutional. Under economic regulation, probably the most important one is the structure to monopolies and antitrust. An interesting and strong approach that's been taken, obviously, by the EU on tech. But the wider economic environment clearly matters. And this is important because this is what gets the entrepreneurs out of bed in the morning. The second area, social regulation, is hopefully what keeps them safe and makes them good societal members. And finally, the last bit, which is institutional regulation, is just the general environment of property protection and recycling in the case of bankruptcy. So we see sort of three general areas, and each one of those has got positive and negative effects. The economic regulation, fantastic, vibrant, moving area, but it can be quite negative if it isn't applied properly. There's a reduced pressure to innovate. In social regulation, all good things, but they are all costly. And are they actually things that should be put on business, or should they be put on wider society? And finally, under institutional regulation, lots of good things about job security and promoting investment, but again, the possibility that in fact you're inhibiting the motivation to innovate. So if we move to the last slide, a lot of people ask us, why is this important? Well, the first thing is, this is not about financial centers or anything like that. It's about technology centers and the widespread dispersal of technology. The second bit is, of the three areas that we're looking at that Mike mentioned earlier, so that's, very much innovation support, creative intensity, and delivering capability. If you could do without one, fun enough, it is probably innovation support. So a center can soar, one might say, with creative intensity and the ability to deliver. And if the institutional support behind that is weak, well, fine, it can actually overtake it. On the other hand, to get things moving, policymakers like to find ways to encourage it. And so for those centers that are behind, I think they'll be seeking what sort of quick policy changes can make the most difference. And that's what we're hoping this index assists them with. So here what we're trying to demonstrate is effectively the inverse U-curve, the sort of a Kuznets curve, if you wish, on what should the regulatory approach be. Too much regulation of different sorts, very high cost of compliance, drives down the innovation factors. Too little leads to a bit of a Wild West. And we've seen some of this with the cryptocurrency regulation, most certainly, just to pick one area in financial services. But we could equally see it in, say, areas like 3D printing, where the widespread dispersal of 3D printers with some of their concomitant sustainability issues, waste disposal, etc., could be particularly dangerous. One of the last things I'd like to conclude on, and just to kind of stem some of the questions in this area, we're extremely conscious that nearly, over 2/3 of the respondents came from Western Europe. And this clearly, to some degree, does bias the initial edition. And we're hoping to branch it out. We have had similar experiences in the past. The Global Financial Centers Index, in fact, started off with something like 55% of people rating it just in London. And we see that dying down. And we're conscious that a lot of empirical research that we've been going through shows that some of the other centers around the place are equally as good as some of the ones rated up at the top. So we're going to be, I anticipate, a fair amount of volatility in this index over the next 2 or 3 editions. But as Mike pointed out, back in 2017, and I think it was published in 2018, was our Smart Jurisdictions Index research report. We actually went into the deep factors here. We're hoping that the rigor that's gone behind this will embed it quite seriously. And so our efforts over the next 6 months, which you can help us with, are to get people to contribute to the index, to get the ratings in there so the factor assessments are more accurate, and hopefully as well to spread those factor assessments globally. Things that we've been through in the past. So the launch of an index is, as I opened, a bit of a sensitive time. But on the other hand, it really only begins to bite in editions 2 or 3. as we begin to see the trend lines. And I would hope that by edition 3, we'll have a much better global spread for the index, and we'll be beginning to see genuine signs of dispersal. It's a particularly interesting time for us, of course, because COVID-19 questions the entire economic efficiency of cities. It's been the intensity and density of cities that have given them these increasing returns to scale. As Jeffrey Weston Santa Fe Institute talks about, the power law effects of cities are quite noticeable. And at the moment, with that being called into question, that's going to affect cities in general, but in particular in this index, it could be most material because technology seems to be an extremely fluid and mobile area. Mike, that's all I had to say. So back over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. And so that concludes the presentation part of the webinar. We've got some questions coming in. Please do use the chat, the facility in the dashboard to put further questions to us. We've got a little bit of time for questions, and we'll try and manage those between us. First of all, I think we have been asked about volatility, and Michael's just addressed that question. But there was kind of a next question is about whether we anticipate increased direct and indirect government support to influence the rankings of the SCI over the next 1 to 3 years. Now, of course, government has been putting a lot of support into the economy in various ways, in different parts of the world, as we've faced the challenges of lockdowns and other consequences of COVID-19. And the reality is, I think that investment in technology will be a key part, where governments are deciding they want to support industry and commerce and development. A place to put your money, if you're a smart government, is in smart development. And so I think I do see those countries that want to be seen as leading technology areas to be investing in education and training, to be investing in business, for example, setting up free office accommodation for startups, wanting to attract people into their cities. They'll be looking at the regulatory environment as well and investing in that. So I think there's no doubt that governments will be investing in smart technology development in various ways. Michael, do you want to add anything to that?
I certainly do. Actually, we had a fascinating webinar yesterday with Robert Hercock, and Dr. Hercock was talking about innovation transforming the post-pandemic world. And I think it's important to distinguish two things, really. The direct and indirect government support that Bob McDowell is asking about, but also the government's role in research. Just bear with me, I have a bit of a frog in the throat. Yeah, so when it comes to direct and indirect government support under COVID itself, I think it's been very interesting to contrast the European and the US. So the US has been giving money effectively directly to people and telling them that they're responsible for their own employment. In Europe, we've been furloughing people, gross generalization, but basically tying them to their work, and unless they've been informed that their job has ended, they're not going to go and seek new employment. So the way in which government is dispersing its support is, I think, very, very important. And there are early signs that people in the US have been taking the monies that they've got and trying to develop new areas to work in, to try and find new forms of employment, because they're not counting on returning to their employment, whereas under the European model, they're effectively waiting to see what happens. So that's kind of one element. The second element is that frequently governments, and I would point in particular to Western Europe, have invested repeatedly over time in direct research. And a lot of evidence questions whether that is a sensible model. Terence Keeley wrote a book back in 1995 questioning this quite intensely. A quarter of a century ago, he believed that government-funded research direct into the research itself, as opposed to challenges, displaced private sector research as a multiple. and that does tend to turn up over the data. But you pointed out, Mike, and I think quite rightly, there's lots of other ways, and education is clearly one of the primary ones, and then encouraging genuine but nevertheless competitive and fair investment is another. So I'm hopeful in a lot of ways that governments are learning some of these lessons about innovation. And don't forget, this is an area that's been replete with white elephants. We had Malaysia making its huge announcements. I think it was about 15 years ago. The Japanese, some 30 years ago, or it was closer to 40 actually, 35 years ago, invested all their stuff into METI's fifth generation computing, which went poof after billions has been spent. So direct government spending is one thing, but creative bits are different. And that's why I hope the index will help to inform those types of decisions.
Thanks, Michael. There's questions asking about specifically, isn't Tel Aviv missing for the index? And as I mentioned earlier, we expect more centres to enter the index as time goes on. The way that you enter the index is to get sufficient people out there to give you an assessment of your performance under those 3 dimensions. And at present, we didn't have enough assessments for Tel Aviv to be able to make for Tel Aviv to get into the index. But certainly, we would expect Tel Aviv to be featuring in future editions of the index, and we do understand the strength of the technology sector in Israel. So at the moment, it's simply that we don't have enough assessments of Tel Aviv through the survey.
I'll underscore that, Mike. You're absolutely correct. We expect Tel Aviv to do very, very well once we can get more of these assessments out there. And so, dear audience members, please not just fill it in yourself, but send it to your friends around the world and say, please fill this in so we do get a much more accurate or fairer assessment.
A question, perhaps you could start on this one, Michael. The question about the relationship between cities, major markets in financial centres, and technology. In other words, technology is mobile almost by definition, but how does proximity to a major market for financial services or for commercial centres or for trade drive the location of technology endeavours and technology business?
Well, this is from Hugh Morris, and Hugh, that's truly an excellent question. The index itself is, to be fair, taking a fairly traditional approach. As I said earlier, that cities as a unit of economic activity is a good one. Hard to analyze because the city boundaries are difficult to define specifically. When the formal boundary of London versus the southeast of England, the New York to DC metropolis, Tokyo. These are all very, very complex things, and the numbers and the statistics are compiled at different levels. But nevertheless, we have based it on city. And as I said in my remarks, if there's a mobile area, it's certainly technology. But what does the proximity to a major market do? Well, it clearly does have material effects. And so if we were to look at, for example, Busan, which very kindly wrote the forward to our index, here, it is a major center for innovation, but it's much more famous as a maritime center. So their geographic proximity to the maritime industry and the ports, et cetera, are very, very important. We can pick on a number of other areas where, for example, the Scandinavian countries, for a variety of reasons, nevertheless, have a very, very good renewable energy and green market, and do therefore very, very well almost in the opposite direction. They do very well in our Global Green Finance Index out of proportion to their size as financial centers in normal circumstances. So there clearly is a lot of symbiosis between technology and the technological performance and the economic activity of the centers in which it's located. But as I said earlier, it could be that this is about to break down, or at least be severely impaired as a relationship. And so we are looking forward to exploring this longitudinally, i.e. over time.
Okay. Sorry, I've got a frog in my throat as well this time. We have a partial question about how can governments balance sort of investment in technology as opposed to stepping back and letting the market ride, I guess. It's part of that regulation curve that we were looking at. And I think the the issue for governments in this field is how do you create an environment in which things can happen and thrive, rather than where do you invest government money. It's more about creating an ecosystem in a place which encourages people to come to work together, to innovate, and this is where I think the clustering of people in places is unlikely to change. Where you want innovation, it's much more likely to happen.
Well,
when you have a geographical area where people come together to work. Michael.
Yeah. Well, this is from Alex. How can governments balance the regulation for technology sectors and legacy industries? Yeah, that's a tough one. In some ways, it's about treating all comers fairly. Going back to Ricardo and comparative advantage, if you happen to have a comparative advantage in a sector, well, don't waste it. So, a good example of this has been the ongoing debate in Australia for well over a century on its dependence on what you might call basic industries and commodities. But it is a very strong and enduring comparative advantage. Performance of Australia's economy over the last 35 years, I think, underscores that. So I'm not sure that it's about getting the balance between legacy and new right, but it is about treating all of them fairly. I think on a second point to this, because Alex, it's a really intriguing area to explore. One of the problems with a lot of government has been, in fact, dragging down new sectors, whether it's technology or another one, simply by supporting legacy industries. So you have to ask yourself, is that fair? And a lot of economists would claim it's a simple answer. I say that with as a sort of a somewhat glib remark, but the simple about of the answer is to provide a safety net and the ability for workers to transition from legacy industries that are going down into new sectors that are going up. However, a lot of recent research has questioned how effective that is amongst the older workforce. So not an easy one. I think that the difficulty has been that most people look at government as kind of tax and spend. And they sort of say, well, take the money and then spend it. And actually, there are a lot of other ways in which governments can provide support. We've had a proposal around for a decade now on the government providing, say, national cyber reinsurance, which would help businesses to locate in a country that actually guaranteed the survival of its networks or compensation if it failed to happen. So a lot of creative ways that governments could actually spend their cash, or not spend cash directly, but provide it in other indirect ways. I mentioned challenges earlier. DARPA went through a period of having a lot of challenges, was seen therefore to be a fantastic research agency. And then during, I think it was the 90s, stopped doing challenges, started spending more in direct research by the government, which didn't get very far, and then returned to challenges, and now seems to be back on a bit of a high. So a lot of different ways that governments can start to balance it. They need to encourage diversity is the big thing. And we had a session the other day where one of the people remarked that the great thing about encouraging diversity was to look to the coffee shop cultures of Europe in the 16 and 1700s, to look at the laboratory cultures of the 1800s, to look at the garages in California. What you want to see is a lot of, as Michael was talking about earlier, free space, the ability to move around and interact, and to lower the cost of having a startup. But within all of that, to have diversity. And I think one of the interesting things that we would also like to explore as we get more data on it is that most of the centers that you see there are centers with high proportions of overseas residents. So a question mark, Tel Aviv was mentioned. Tel Aviv's had a huge influx over decades of people from abroad. Shanghai is arguably one of the most open Chinese cities. Shenzhen as well. London is, something like 40% foreign born, so under certain measures. So you've got this idea that it's about diversity of thinking and opinion and getting people together that makes it happen. And governments are ill-suited to that. Governments are process machines. And so making that work is extremely difficult. Sorry, Mike, I probably went on a bit too long.
No worries at all. It's a really interesting point. Thank you very much for raising that. The last question I think we've got time for is a question about how do centres learning in London, New York, etc., contribute to their ranking in the index. And one of the things we do in the index is look at the correlation between each of the quantitative data measures that go into the compilation of the index and the overall results, and just look at the R-squared correlation. And looking at the top 30 ranked quantitative measures by R-squared correlation, actually none of them are around educational attainment or learning, which is interesting. In other words, the things that seem to be making a difference in this index are the business environment, the infrastructure, less so the human capital factors. Having said that, I think that it's no surprise that places like Oxford and Cambridge, Boston, who are known for being centres of excellence in research and learning, feature well in the Smart Centres Index. There is a relationship between having people who are doing leading edge research close to clusters of innovation and technology. And I think that's something we will need to track as we take the Smart Centres Index forward and see whether that or whether being a commercial global centre comes out as the more important factor in building a technology offer. Michael?
Yeah, well, it is interesting, not least as I was in Cambridge in the very early 80s, Cambridge, UK, also Cambridge, Mass, but I was in Cambridge, UK in the early 80s setting up business. We were the second science business, so it's that recent. And we had very few relations with the university at all, even though we were a science business and they had departments in it. They were very hard to work with, and probably still are to some degree. But it was the access to the skilled students that mattered. And I think a lot of people have been spending time trying to make universities work with business. That may be a good thing and it might work, although it's failed to really connect in the UK, despite decades of approaches on it. But the businesses do interact directly with people in their environment, in their neighborhood, who are the students working or in research areas, and then they move back and forth to businesses on internships or on work experience, and then finally into jobs. So that's one element. I think the second element is also an interesting diversity one. Some of the sectors, and I want to get more research on this as we go forward. Zen has been using biodiversity indices to measure economic performance for some 15 or 17 years. And one of the things I'm interested in is the biodiversity indices for these centers on their university and higher education areas. And let me give you a quick example. In Tokyo University is very dominant. In Oxford or Cambridge, we know who's dominant. London, on the other hand, actually does have the fifth-rated university in the world, UCL, extremely strong, but it has another 72 institutions of higher learning and some 140 or something like that, learned societies of various forms. So it's actually an extremely rich culture. And you will find, for example, Bob McDowell, I know, belongs to the Royal Anthropological Institute. Well, an anthropologist running into somebody set something up. And in fact, I do recall specifically Richard Durant, who was the founder of Zopa, the peer-to-peer lending service, was inspired to move from Egg, which is a subsidiary of Prudential, through a chance meeting with an anthropologist, decided this was the way to do lending. Now, you'll get that if you've got a huge variety of various centers around, somewhat competing with each other for ideas and attention. So it's going to be an interesting road for us, Mike, as we try and get some of these numbers together.
Thank you, Michael. Well, we've come to the end of the time we'd set for the webinar. There is more detail in the full report, which you can find on our website. And as I say, we'll email a link out to you in the next day or so. We'll be looking forward to the next edition of the Smart Centres Index, which is due to be published at the end of this year. And as both Michael and I have mentioned, the survey on which the SCI is partially based is available all the time for you to take part in. The link to the survey is up on the screen at the moment. Again, we'll include that in a follow-up email. But it's really helpful to us if you were to take a look at the survey, fill it in, and share it with your friends in terms of trying to get a better handle on what's happening in this world over on smart technology. And that wraps up today's webinar. Thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you, Michael, for your observations and for your thoughts. We'd be, of course, always pleased to have any follow-up questions. If there's anything that strikes you after the event, please get in touch with us, and we'll try to engage with that after the event. But many thanks. Have a good day for those of you who are joining us from Europe. Have a good evening for those of you who are here from Asia and other parts of the world. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mike.